Good morning, party people, and welcome to Malibu, California. I'm down here by the Malibu Pier. I had a weekend free on my calendar that I just looked out of nowhere, and I was like, why don't I drive up here? I've got the cars that I've been meaning to put more miles on since I got them, and I said, all right, let's go take one of them and go take a run up here. I know I just had a whole lot of work done on the Jag with the new stereo and new electronics and all that. But on a place like Malibu, it just really seems so nice to go take the 911 because you can run around with the top off, and it's a lot of canyon roads that are really fun to drive. At some point, I got to bring the Jag up here just because the engine noise will sound so great off the canyons, but this time helmet won out. So let's take a look and see what you've got in terms of questions. We'll spend a little bit of time before I go head out. I'm actually going to walk right out there to the pier. There's a really cute little shop out there that always has all kinds of little t-shirts and stuff that I love. I think I got this exact t-shirt from there, come to think of it. So the first question for the morning is JD. JD says, have you ever encountered a very weird case during performance tuning where you just couldn't get the query across the finish line? I love how he uses those words. Specifically just because SQL Server didn't want to play along nicely. What did you end up doing to overcome it? Oh, totally. I run into that all the time. And the biggest thing that causes it is estimations, where SQL Server estimates too high of a number of rows are going to come back or too low of a number of rows that are going to come back, and then chooses an inefficient query plan. The details of what you can do to overcome that are all in my mastering query tuning class, but I'm just going to give you a few examples off the top of my head. Breaking the query up into phases, letting SQL Server pull just some of the rows first and understand how many rows are going to be involved for the rest, hinting it, giving it a better idea of how many rows are going to come back from each part of the query, using things like parameter hinting, not default values, but option optimize for, to guide SQL Server down a path of thinking that a certain amount of data will come back when it actually doesn't. And there are a ton of other query hints. I used to be very against query hints because it felt like I was kind of taking all of SQL Server's options away. But these days, in a lot of my consulting, people don't come to me unless they've tried the things that they learned in the fundamentals and mastering training classes. And at that point, then we do have to start resorting to things like hints. But I think that part of that is because so many more people have gone through my fundamentals and masters classes now. So they know, I try to share freely everything that I know. Freely is the wrong word, because of course they have to be in training classes for that to really work. Let's see here. Let's get the next question in. So the next question is from, file away the old one, Accidental DBA. Accidental DBA says, do you have any recommended DMV queries that you like to run for a scenario where SQL Server is on fire and SP Blitz first is really slow in returning results? Yes, SP who is active. SP who is active is a stored procedure by Atom Mechanic, and it's now open source. It's kind of the world default in when you have very bad performance pressure just to see which queries are running. And then Eric Darling has a relatively newer one called, if I remember right, SP Pressure Detector. And I don't do a good enough job of thinking about that one quickly when I'm under pressure. But you should check that out because he did it as like a lightweight alternative to SP Blitz First. SP Blitz First does a whole lot of checks, so when the server's truly on fire, you can run into a situation where it takes 60, 90, 120 seconds in order to run. Try Eric Darling's SP Pressure Detector, which really focuses on the most urgent and most common causes of servers being on fire. Next up, Ashok asks, hi Brent, I'm moving all my databases from on-premises to Azure VM, not managed instances. What's the best method to migrate SSISDB and reports DB to Azure? Which backup and restore work? I'm on SQL Server 2016 SE. So if you said you're doing Azure VMs, specifically Azure VMs, there is no difference between an Azure VM and a regular on-premises VM when it comes to backup and restore. The same backup and restore tricks that you use on-premises, you can also use up in the cloud. It would be different if you were talking about Azure SQL DB, Azure SQL DB hyperscale managed instances, but you said Azure VMs, there is no difference there. So one of the most common techniques is to use log shipping, because with transaction log shipping, you can get the database really close to point in time and then just do a failover relatively quickly. The failover isn't built into SQL Server. That's something that you have to manage yourself with things like DNS CNAMEs. But in terms of the backup and recovery, there's no difference at all. Next up, Zatrikion asks, hi Brent, is parameter sniffing the same in SQL Server in the cloud and on physical SQL Server? Yes, they're identical. He says, or do they work differently? The one thing that I will caution you about is that Azure SQL DB is vulnerable in a different way in that it can restart at any time and you're not aware of it restarting. Microsoft has put a ton of work into patching as quickly as it possibly can, and also failing over back and forth in things like managed instances. So when you were running your own SQL servers on premises, you were keenly aware of when you had a failover. In the cloud, that may be less so. You may be surprised to learn that there was a failover. And of course, whenever there's a failover, that clears your plan cache when you fail over from one server to another, or when the instance restarts, which will, of course, trigger parameter sniffing. Next up, Dmitriy says, when I'm migrating from standalone SQL Server to Azure SQL DB, what's the most efficient solution to replace cross-database queries? Unfortunately, there isn't a good one. Cross-database queries are one of those showstoppers that mean you're probably going to be better off going to managed instances rather than plain Azure SQL DB. In theory, you can use external tables to set up cross-database queries. It's a giant pain in the rear because you have to predefine every table that you're going to access and all of its structures. So if the structures change on the other database, your queries can stop working. Like if you just assume you can access any columns that are present on the other server. So consider using managed instances rather than Azure SQL DB. It's very similar, it's just a little bit different. Accidental DBA asks, hi Brent, do you have any guidelines for determine how much RAM the SQL Server should have? My database is 7 terabytes. So let me ask it to you a different way. How do you know when your server is fast enough? If you can answer that with metrics, woo, big wave there. If you can answer that with metrics, not with feelings, then you'll stand a better chance of knowing exactly how much memory is enough. But if you can't tell me how to measure when it's fast enough, then my answer would be give it enough RAM that your users are happy enough with the performance. And of course, that can be all over the map, depending on how fast your storage is, whether or not your queries are storage bottlenecked, how many queries per second you're actually doing, what the user's tolerance for slow queries is, like what a slow query means to a user. But that's why you're not finding simple answers out there, is because you don't have a simple answer to that question. How do you know when your queries are fast enough in terms of an exact metric, not just feelings? Null Pointer Exception says, thank you for everything you do for the community. You're welcome. Random question. Any ideas or theory why SQL Server doesn't support temp tables in views? It would make it so much easier to give the optimized views for performance. Sure. I basically talk about this in my Fundamentals of Temp DB class. The problem is that temp table structures can change at any time. You can't guarantee that a temp table is going to have the same structure every single time that it's used. When you talk about a view needs to check the structure of the underlying tables. You can't have the tables changing all of the time in a way that would break the views. So it just doesn't make sense to call views on top of temp tables whose structure is inherently changing all of the time. Now you might be saying, well, but Brent, my temp tables always look the same way. To which I would respond, you probably don't know your workload quite well enough, but even if you do, you're the exception rather than the rule. Next up, Jiri says, when I'm working for smaller companies, I mostly see apps when SQL Server is used as an application server, meaning all business logic is in database objects, and the app is just a GUI. What do you mean about such architecture? What do you mean, what do I mean? And what approach does it require when concerning SQL Server? So I'm fine with that architecture, because with most small companies, they don't have enough resources to have a database tier and an application tier and a front-end tier. They just don't have enough people or enough development effort, enough development time. So I'm fine with it. It makes no difference to me whether somebody does it that way or whether they use SQL Server as a pure data store. The thing that's nice when people use SQL Server as an application server, and when I say application server, I really just mean putting the logic in the database. The thing that's nice when you do that is that if someone calls me in for emergency performance tuning, I can actually make the changes quickly and they can take effect instantly. Whereas if I have to tell them, hey, go rewrite that C# code, then it can take them 3 months in order to make the change, test the change, get it into source control, deploy it out to all of their application servers. I have plenty of stories where I've had to make an emergency change to something in order to keep somebody's website alive, and that was only possible because everything was inside of the SQL Server. Now, on the flip side, I can tell you that just this past week, I was working with a company that had over 10,000 stored procedures in one database. And the downside of it is that SQL Server doesn't give you very good testability tools, very good source control tools, very good deployment tools. There are kind of hit or miss solutions out there, but it's nowhere near as well-defined and established as application server testability, source control, deployment tools. Next up, we have Kapil says, what is the best way to identify potential bottlenecks in performing troubleshooting? I teach that in my Mastering Server Tuning class. Oh, you wanted a 30-second answer. Dude, if I could tell you that, I wouldn't need 3 days to tell you in the class. So it's time to buckle up and go to class. Now, the good news is that starting November the 1st, I'm running all kinds of sales on my training classes. I do an annual Black Friday sale where you get like 60, 70, 80% off of my training classes. So if you want to learn more about that, go to brentozar.com/Black Friday, and you can sign up for early notifications of what the sales are going to be. That notification will come out near the end of October so that you can start prepping your managers about what's going to happen there. Little Bobby Tables asks, yo Brent, issue I have with log shipping. I rebuild my indexes on my largest tables monthly because I have standard edition. This creates very large transaction log backups, 8 gigabytes. You think 8 gigabytes is large? The video you're watching is shot in 4K. I sit here talking for like 20, 30 minutes, and the video file you're watching is larger than that. 8 gigabytes Think about how many 8 gigabyte log files your phone could hold. Your phone. That's not big data. 8 gigabytes. If a vendor gave you an 8 gigabyte USB drive as a freebie, you would throw it away. It's useless. 8 gigabyte, come on now. It says, transaction, my backups are every 10 minutes. My log restore fails on 30% of the time, requiring a full backup restore. Have you ever seen this issue? No, something is going on in your environment where, I'm gonna be brutally honest. If you think 8 gigabytes is big, you probably don't have enough log file space allocated to your SQL servers. You don't have enough data file space allocated to your SQL servers. Give your SQL servers room to breathe. At least think of them as the size of your phone. My phone has 512 gigabytes of solid state storage. 8 gigabytes, who cares? Now, I say very casually, who cares? No, I say very casually, who cares? Next up, Pat asks, I'm a terrible person. Pat asks, hi Brent, I'm an accidental DBA here. The main alert that I get in my monitoring solution is baseline operating system paging. My operating system is paging to disk. Also, disk queue length at times, like today is 1 to 6. If I'm Googling to see whether it's important, it yields a lot of it depends. How can I tell if these are bad? Okay, first off, I don't know who told you to monitor those metrics. Both of those are junk. So that's a good sign that you want to get to training classes. I bet one of two things is happening. Either you've been working with SQL Server for a really long time and you just stumbled into database administration. And 10, 20 years ago, those were vaguely important. Or you're relying on free resources for learning and you're looking at very old material. That was important 20 years ago when we didn't have good metrics. Today we have much better metrics than that. Both of those are junk. So disk queue length doesn't mean anything because SQL Server batches activity off when it does things like checkpoints, when it does things like transaction log backups. It's normal to see disk queue length in the hundreds, for example. So you can totally ignore that. It doesn't mean anything. Operating system paging shouldn't mean anything as long as you only have SQL Server installed on that server and nothing else. Where I see people run into problems is when they treat SQL Server as an application server and they install IIS, reporting services, analysis services, all these things. And then SQL Server comes under memory pressure and other things are paging. But as long as you only install SQL Server on that box, and as long as you follow my SQL Server setup checklist about how much memory to leave available on the box, that stuff doesn't matter. You can totally ignore it. And it's a good sign, too, that you should get to more modern training classes, too. I don't just say that because I sell it. I mean, you can go to anybody's training classes in the year 2021. They wouldn't tell you to look at those metrics. Mike says, favorite subject, transactional replication. And with that, I'm going to skip that question. I don't work on transactional replication, sorry. Your best bet there is to post a question at things like dba.stackexchange.com. I would rather drink bleach and shoot myself with swallow horse pills than I would deal with transactional replication ever again in my life. I'd throw myself off this balcony, which probably wouldn't kill me. It's probably only like 10 feet tall. Next up, George says, hi Brent, I need to implement a logging process for one of our accounting solutions and the process is in it. Can you handle can you suggest a good lightweight tool or methodology that can handle this and scale well? A logging process? I have no idea what you mean. This sounds to me more like a development task. Be more specific about what you're looking for and put it on a programming place like stackoverflow.com. But be as specific as you can, because I don't even really understand what you're asking there in the question. Next up, Magnus says, hi Brent, I work at an MSP, managed service provider or managed solutions provider, as an infrastructure DBA. We don't do any performance tuning and almost no t-sql code authoring. I've only worked as a DBA in this environment for 4 years. When is it time to leave, and when will I regret not leaving? Oh, that's so interesting. Okay, so if you're a pure production database, what the term that you are is called a production database administrator, where you manage backups, corruption repair, cluster failovers, security, instance building and tearing down. Is it time for you to leave now? No, you could honestly, even if you're like 25, you could honestly do that for the next 20 years and you will have a career. I know that there are people out there who are saying, you gotta get out of there now, but you could be okay for the next 20 years because the number of people who come out of college knowing how to do this is a big fat zero, and it's hard to get on the job training, and you're probably very likely on your way to becoming a senior. There will be, for the next 20 years, jobs available for people like you, but there will be less of them, which means that if you don't like the place where you are, the shop where you're at, or if you want to be in a specific geographic area, you may have challenges accomplishing that goal. The jobs that are available that do that might be in companies you don't necessarily like, or in places that you don't necessarily want to live, because often jobs like this will require physical presence in a data center just because the people are old school like that. So when is the tough part, of course, is going to be to gather experience doing other things, doing like development database administration. You're not going to get it at that company. So if you decide you want more options for yourself long term, again, I'm just saying, let's say you're 25. If you're 25 and you go, I want more options long term, you should probably start passively looking. Passively looking is when you're like, well, I got my resume out there and I'm going to do an interview or two a week, but if I don't happen to get one, I don't really care. Oh, wow, there's the plane. Oh, there it is. Oh, a helicopter over there. It's a loud helicopter, too. Let him go by. There's also a very tiny plane. 3 tiny planes? 3 tiny planes offshore. They'll probably come into your view here in a second. Plus 3 folks on powered surfboards. They have those motorized surfboards where you can kind of glide along at the top of the water. Those will be coming through your view here shortly as well. So if you want to get experience doing something else, like because let's say you're young, you're 25, and you want to find a better long-term series of options, what you may want to do is start passively looking, have you put your resume together and send it to a couple few recruiters or post it on Stack Exchange. Stack Exchange has a careers site where you can post your resume anonymously and do an interview a week, let's say, so that you're getting a feel for what's out there, and commit to yourself that, like, I'm not going to take the first job that gets offered to me. I'm really going to shop around because I want to find the best place to land for several years. And when you get the opportunity to take one, make sure that you make it clear both in your resume cover letter and during the interview process that you want to learn some other technology, whether it's other databases, whether it's doing development database administration. And during the interview process, ask them, like, okay, here are my goals. What are you going to do for me in terms of training opportunities, mentoring with other people? What will my task load look like? Can I talk to some of the people that I would be working with? Because you have the luxury of a good full-time job, I want you to find one that you're going to be really happy with over the next several years. All right, we were going for quite a while there. 8:30, yeah, perfect. I'm going to go head out over to the pier there on Malibu and go do a little shopping here. The shop out there, I believe, opens at 8 o'clock. You know what? I should actually check that, because if it doesn't, and you know what? It's too late now. I've already told you that I'm going. Let's see here. When does that little pier shop open? It's called Ranch at the Pier. And it's open! All right, screw you people. All right, so I'm going to go hop out over there and go do some shopping, and I will see y'all later. I just learned, and today, what else am I doing? So there's a great little restaurant over there on the pier as well called Malibu Farm that I absolutely love. You can just sit out there and watch the waves. Have reservations for sunset too. Sunset's around 6:30, and sit out here. Really, when I come out here to Malibu, there's really just basically two things that I do. One is to sit here on the beach and walk around and at the pier, and the other is take the car up into all the canyons. They're just beautiful driving canyons here, really lots of fun. So I will see y'all at the next office hours. I also just learned I have a start-stop recording button right here. It's so convenient if I can just find it. Adios.